Hello you fine folks and welcome to the Rooiboss channel. It's time for another wacky World War II. Hit it! There's actually nothing to put there. I don't have an intro screen or anything. That's boring, old school YouTube. You know what's not boring? Tanks. You know why they're called tanks? Because the first British prototype in 1915 resembled a water tank. And to maintain secrecy, the experiment was named the Tank, and the name stuck. Tanks were explored in World War I, but development exploded in the interwar period, and a new breed of deadly machines was battle-tested and refined in World War II. Around here, the mantra is experimentation means wacky ideas, so let's have a look at some of the wackiest tank designs from World War II. We have a quick disclaimer for the list, which is that we're not being super strict with the precise classification of a tank. For the most part, a tracked armored vehicle with a turret is considered a tank, otherwise it becomes a self-propelled gun or tank destroyer or armored car, etc. We're not being too picky here, we're just looking at weird, tank-esque vehicles, so don't freak out if there's a few SPGs included. Our first tank on the list is New Zealand's first tank, the Semple tank, also known as Big Bob. In 1940, the war was in full swing, minus the US, and New Zealand had fears of an invasion by an aggressive Imperial Japan. New Zealand didn't have an armored vehicle program, and it wasn't certain that they'd be able to import Allied armor, so the people took matters into their own hands. The Minister of Works, Bob Semple, was inspired by a 1937 American design that took a tractor and bolted on an armored shell as a DIY science fair battle platform, working not from blueprints or plans, but rather from an American postcard that displayed the tractor tank. Semple created this masterpiece, a Caterpillar tractor with a frame made from corrugated iron bolted to the base. The hope was that these frames could be produced in advance and staged around the nation, so that if an invasion occurred, they could be bolted on top of local tractors in a matter of hours. The specs: 12 feet tall and 25 tons with a top speed of 15 miles per hour. 8 to 12 millimeter armor that might be able to stop small caliber bullets. 6 light machine guns because no cannons were available. 6 to 8 crew members necessary. Price adjusted for inflation, $200,000. It had extremely poor performance, the vibration from the tractor made its guns inaccurate, it had to stop in order to change gears, it was scrapped. That same year, still in New Zealand, a man by the name of Ernest James Schofield had a different idea for an indigenous tank, which became known as the Schofield tank. The scheme was to incorporate the chassis of a large Chevrolet truck with the suspension system of a universal carrier. The system featured both wheels and tracks, and it could switch between the two according to the demands of the terrain. The initial model didn't perform well, but an improved version was equipped with a 40mm 2-pounder gun and a coaxial machine gun. It could reach up to 45 miles per hour on wheels and only weighed about 5 tons. However, by the time the second model was completed in 1942, New Zealand began operating tanks provided by the Allies, and further implementation was unnecessary. Additionally, the Brits had a look at the design in 1943, and while their evaluation wasn't all bad, they advised that the project be stopped. Next up, the BT-42. The BT-42 was a Finnish assault gun that was constructed from Soviet BT-7 tanks and British 4.5-inch howitzers.
And the very next day, General Montgomery decided to give me the Congressional Medal of Honor.
Now that's incredible. A Canadian soldier getting an American medal from a British general.
The Finns were facing an aggressive Soviet Union that was fielding powerful tanks, and they needed an armored force of their own. The Finnish army accomplished this by accumulating captured enemy tanks and refielding or converting this armor, but most of these vehicles had light armor and weapons. The BT-42 was a proposed solution for anti-tank warfare, which is why the Finns used the strongest cannon that they could feasibly fit on the vehicle. However, these 4.5-inch howitzers still proved ineffective against enemy armor. In one encounter, a BT-42 landed 18 hits on a Soviet T-34, but didn't even stop it. The Finns eventually received reinforcement armor from Germany and retired the BT-42 with Stug 3s. For our number 4, let's scale things down a bit and talk about the Polish TK Tankette. The TK series appeared in a few different variants, but all were modeled on the chassis of the British interwar Carden-Lloyd Tankette. The TKs and TKSs, which was basically a TK 2.0, was used commonly for recon and infantry support, but they proved to be basically no threat to German armored vehicles as they were mostly only armed with light machine guns. However, a handful of TKSs were armed with 20mm heavy machine guns, and there's a report of a man named Edmund Orlik who drove one of these and allegedly was able to destroy 10 panzers, including a Panzer IV. These tankettes were the primary unit of the Polish armored forces, and after Poland got steamrolled in 1939, Germany refielded many of these tanks tanks for patrols, training, and even snow plowing. So glorious. Next up, we have one of the 2,378 modifications of the M4 Sherman, the Skink anti-aircraft tank. The Skink was a Canadian design that took their production of the Sherman and added a turret fitted with 4 20mm anti-aircraft autocannons, resulting in a mobile anti-aircraft platform. This premise wasn't uncommon, and in particular, both the US and Japan designed light armored vehicles that served in this role. This was the only Canadian attempt though, and it was one of the most well-armored, self-propelled anti-aircraft guns of World War II. Unfortunately, in the later stages of the Skink's development in 1944, it was determined that the Luftwaffe was no longer enough of a threat to warrant continued production. The project was scrapped with only 3 models being fully produced, but it definitely had style.
But you can't deny
Skink anti-aircraft tank.
your style.
Our number 6 is a tank that never saw service and was produced only as a few prototypes, the RBT-5. The RBT-5 was an experimental variant of the Soviet BT-5, which itself was an iteration in a long line of BT tanks that saw service from 1932 through 1945. The Soviets are known for their incorporation of rocket artillery in the war, and this design was an early experiment in that field during the 1930s. The RBT-5 was to carry 2 550-pound rockets designated tank torpedoes that could be used against fortifications and heavy tanks from a great distance. The pairing of light tank and massive rockets didn't work out well though, as these bombs proved inaccurate and the BT-5 chassis became clumsy under their weight. The RBT-5 project ended in 1933, but it will live forever in our hearts. While we're talking about Soviet tanks, let's cover one of my favorite tanks from World War II, the T-35. The T-35 was a monster of a tank, especially when you consider that it was designed in the early 30s. Considering a Tiger I, the T-35 was comparable in height and width, but it was 11 feet longer and was fitted with 5 turrets. 1 main turret with a 76mm gun and a coaxial machine gun, 2 45mm gun turrets, and 2 machine gun turrets. It was crewed by 10 men, it could carry 10,000 rounds for its machine guns, and a combined 322 rounds for its main and secondary guns. The T-35 was designed as a breakthrough tank in opposition to the static trench warfare of World War I, and it was often referred to as a land battleship, which is one of the dopest things I've ever heard an armored vehicle referred to as. Though decently reliable compared to other Soviet tanks of the day, the T-35 was quite slow and it had unimpressive armor ranging from 11 to 30 millimeters. While these tanks saw combat in the early part of the war, only about 60 tanks were produced and the series was cancelled due to a high cost. Next up, we have our only German entry on this list, the Sturmtiger. The Sturmtiger was a heavy assault gun that was based on the chassis of the Tiger I, but was fitted with a significantly more powerful gun. In fact, the original intention was to fit this vehicle with a 210mm howitzer, but when it turned out that that weapon was unavailable, they just opted instead for a 380mm rocket-propelled mortar. The apparent need for such a weapon arose from the Battle of Stalingrad, where urban fighting was fierce and the Germans wanted to be able to demolish an entire building with a single round, and the Stug 3s with 15cm cannons weren't cutting it. For this purpose, the Sturmtiger was also designed with increased armor that reached up to 150mm at its thickest face. 18 of these machines were produced and they indeed saw combat, but by the time they entered service, Germany was on the retreat rather than the offensive. This meant that the Sturmtiger didn't get to see combat in the way it was meant to, since a heavily armored assault gun that only carries 14 rounds of ammunition isn't usually your first pick in a defensive role. One Sturmtiger is credited with taking out an entire group of Shermans with a single round though, which is not a bad KD. For our final 2 entries, we're going to have a look at what the resourceful British got up to. Number 9 is the Churchill Bobbin tank. The Churchill was the Sherman of the British Armored Forces in that it was a platform that was actively experimented with and modified for specialized tasks. The Bobbin, also called the carpet layer, was created as a solution for making a sandy, pebbled terrain easier to traverse for heavy vehicles. This was especially important for beachhead assaults, and the Churchill Bobbin was used first in the British Dieppe raid and then in Normandy on D-Day. This wacky tank could unfurl a length of heavy matting across sandy terrain, allowing other tanks and vehicles to advance without issue. I've also heard that this carpet could be used to mark a safe path that had been cleared of mines, but I was unable to confirm that particular use. To finish off our list, please welcome a very British design, the Praying Mantis tank. That's right, a tank with an adjustable height turret that could peek over obstacles and embankments and then rain machine gun fire down upon the enemy. What you should note is how small this thing was. That box was the crew compartment, and both the driver and gunner had to fit in that thing lying down. Only 2 prototypes were produced, and during trials, surprise surprise, it was discovered that it was quite difficult to operate. My complaint on this thing is that the whole idea was to have a vehicle that could raise its weapon over cover, without exposing itself to enemy fire, but you've still got a guy stuck at the top of this thin metal box operating those machine guns. So yeah, development was cancelled, but you can still see the second prototype today in the Bovington Tank Museum in the UK. That's our top 10, but I do have 2 bonus tanks I want to mention: the Kugelpanzer Ball Tank and the A40 Flying Tank. I didn't qualify them for the list because I've already covered them in different videos, Hitler's super weapons and bizarre airplanes respectively, which you'll find here. Thank you guys for watching. Comment what tank you drive to prom, consider liking if this was worth your time, and do the subscribe if you want to see more wacky World War II videos. I'll see you guys in the next video. Ruibos out.